We often hear about like founder mode. How did the FBI actually do about running this company? And were they running a profitable company? And how did it not leak out that the FBI was actually in charge of this company?
That's the really funny thing. They were running a tech company. They had to get Amazon servers, I think Google Cloud as well. They had to get the hardware, as I mentioned, eSIMs as well, which allowed the drug traffickers to communicate wherever they were. You had to have constant uptime for this network as well. Like if you're trying to run a secure network, it has to be pretty reliable anyway. Now imagine running a secure network for criminals. They want a good product. They're paying a lot of money for this, hundreds if not thousands of dollars for a 6 or a 12-month subscription, which comes to the profitability. The FBI would never tell me exactly how much money they made. It was basically the one thing they would not tell me, even when I asked multiple times in my calls with them. But what they did describe is that the money would go from the individual users to the resellers to then people higher up in Anom until eventually to the FBI, where it would be reinvested into the company. It's just smart business sense, right? You take your revenue and then your profits and you put some of them back into the firm, and they were doing all of that. And they scaled. They scaled just like any other tech company, but there's that constant tension, which again comes to a head when they have to shut the company down, in that they want to be successful, but not too successful. And that's not just because of the reason I mentioned where they'd be swimming in too much data, but what happens if this sort of normal people start to get these phones? That would be really, really bad. And in some rare instances, it did land in the hands of civilians. At least that was indicated to me.
One of the major themes of your book was that having this encrypted network that had some of the biggest underworld kingpins using this almost exclusively, it gave the authorities a huge big picture that they never really would have thought. And as you mentioned before, where there was multiple encrypted phones in the book, you're like, maybe you have the production side of drugs is on one encrypted phone, then maybe the distribution side of things is on another encrypted phone. So they never really had the whole picture. Then once the FBI basically got all these other encrypted phones shut down, everyone was forced to go to Anom. Now all of a sudden, the entire picture becomes clear because they're having every aspect of the vertical integration is now fully exposed.
Yeah, it's interesting because back in the day of when encrypted phone companies first started, some of them could speak to one another, mostly because they were just using PGP email, which stands for pretty good privacy, just adds a layer of end-to-end encryption to emails. A real pain in the ass to use. I say that as someone who taught myself to use it and all that sort of thing. And of course, companies like Phantom Secure made it easier for these drug traffickers. But what these companies realized was that being able to connect between networks was actually bad for business. You wanted to make a closed network because then everybody would have to move over to your phone platform. Say you're a big time drug trafficker at the top of your pyramid. If you were using the phone, everybody else underneath you has to use a Phantom or a Sky or whatever. So that's why the encrypted phone companies did it. The side effect of that, as you say, is that you almost have these compartmentalized silos around the world. The money launderers might be on Sky, while as the people taking the drugs off the shipping container in Antwerp or wherever are on EncroChat. And often people will buy multiple phones. I mean, I've seen a photo of one of the money launderers I talk about in the book called Abdullah Izzeldin, and he's in a gym crouched down in a squat, and he has something like 3 mobile phones on the floor of the gym, and he's like just flicking through them because that's what you have to do when you're managing across these different networks. But as you say, it was better for the FBI when everybody moved to Anom. And to be fair, it was probably better for the users as well. They didn't have to carry around a small bag of mobile phones in their pockets or whatever. But that opened them up, of course, to much more surveillance because all of their operations were now Anom, or at least a much larger percentage of them.
Did they get any insights into what was going on in the United States? You mentioned the U.S. really couldn't do anything because of the privacy laws. But then you were mentioning that Australia was kind of being able to look at it, but they maybe weren't able to necessarily act on that information. But did that kind of give them, because you don't really talk, most of this stuff really takes place in Europe in the book, and Australia as well.
Yeah, so Australian authorities, as I said, the FBI can look at phones in America because that would be a bureaucratic nightmare. The Australians were allowed to look at phones in the US, but only for threats to life. Where it was like, okay, if somebody is about to die or get assassinated, the Australians could tell the FBI. I never heard about cases of that actually happening. I do know that Anom phones did land in America because I've seen the spreadsheets which show the shipments of phones around the world to various different countries and physical addresses and post boxes. So I know that's the case for sure. That being said, again, the FBI really, really did want it, and it really annoyed a lot of the law enforcement officials working on this case, especially Andrew Young, who was the main prosecutor for sort of the bulk of the operation. He was, once it was all set up in Australia and worldwide and going, he was actively trying to get it working in America, and he eventually quit because there were just so many bureaucratic roadblocks to being able to surveil people in America. And he thinks that if that had been the case, maybe there would have been another 500 simultaneous arrests in the US during the big day of raids in June 2021. I think the San Diego FBI probably sees it as a missed opportunity. I am sure operations like this are happening. We actually saw a week or two ago that there was another encrypted phone company called Ghost the authorities hacked as well. The FBI was somewhat involved in that, but they didn't mention any arrests. But I can definitely see in the future the FBI might continue to try to get access to phones in the US. That being said, actually, anecdotally, I have heard that criminals in the States do use a lot more commercial apps like Signal and Telegram. So maybe they don't actually have as much a pressing need as other authorities, because the phones are a scourge, as it was described to me in Australia, and they are the backbone of organized crime in Europe as well.
Anom was essentially like a honeypot, and you just mentioned about how the FBI hacked into another. Yeah, you just mentioned that, but how common is this? Tor, which is an anonymous web browser, was created by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. You mentioned Bitcoin quite a bit in the book, which we can get to, but the actual cryptographic hash function, SHA-256, was developed by the NSA, or the National Security Agency in the USA. And some people think that Bitcoin could have been created by the CIA or some other global intelligence agency, which I think is likely and would be ironic for the people that think that they're
they're avoiding the government by making a completely traceable network of all their paint.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist with the Bitcoin one, but the fact is we all know that Tor was created by the U.S. Navy. There's no disputing that. So how common are these honeypots, whether globally or even at a smaller scale?
Yeah, I guess just first on sort of the Tor stuff, you're right. And I think it sort of goes back to the point I made earlier about, some people in the FBI really wanted this and others, DOJ in Washington, tried to basically shut it down. There are so many different pushing and pulling motivations inside government. And yes, the Navy was the initial creator, researcher, and funder of Tor, right?